Did you know that on April 15, 1912, Fenway Park in Boston, Massachusetts was supposed to open for its inaugural season, but due to the sinking of the Titanic, that event was postponed until April 20th out of respect for the tragedy and the dead. The sinking of the Titanic was one of the most tragic events in the world history and one that has had the most impact on our society even to this day. Not only has this event changed laws governing ships and cruise liners and the laws that apply to them, but the Titanic took with her many of society's elite at the time and left both American and the world reeling from this unthinkable event. So today I want to explore with you the impact the shipwreck has had on society as a whole, as well as discuss some of the changes that were put into place as a result of the world's largest ship sinking. But I think to understand this event, we must go back to the beginning. The RMS Titanic was built by the White Star Line beginning in 1909 and took 2 years to complete on April 10th of 1912. The Titanic, the world's largest luxury ship, left Southampton and was destined for New York. It carried 2,240 passengers in crew. It weighed 46,328 tons and was 882 feet long, and daily consumed 825 tons of coal. It was considered to be unsinkable. However, on the night of April 15th, 1912, at approximately 8:30 p.m., the ship encountered an iceberg, and instead of hitting the berg head-on the ship, it reversed and turned sharply, causing the ship to graze along the side of the iceberg, causing long gash in the hull under the ship's waterline. Unfortunately, no one realized the damage that had occurred, and by the time they did, 5 of the 15 watertight compartments in the bulkhead had filled with water, and as they continued to fill, each compartment was able to pour into the one next to it, causing the ship to be weighed down to the point that it was inevitable that it would sink due to the weight of the water. At approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the Titanic finally sank to its fate at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It took with it more than 1,500 of its passengers and was one of the most shocking events the world has yet to be seen. As newspapers began to report on this tragic event, it became clear to everyone that not only did the ship sink, but it took with it some very important and influential people of high society, and people began to wonder how their absences would be filled. Due to the celebrity status of this luxury liner, the ship contained names such as Thomas Andrews, who was the shipbuilder, J. Bruce Ismay, who was the White Star's managing director, as well as many more well-known names such as John Jacob Astor, a wealthy aristocrat, and of course Margaret Brown. Some of these celebrities and influential people made it off the ship. Some went down with it, but the majority of the victims of this horrific tragedy came from the third-class passengers, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. As the news spread about the sinking of the Titanic, inquiries were made, interviews were given, and stories were told. In fact, the sinking of the Titanic has become the most covered story between movies, documentaries, and books over the past 100 years. Of course, there were many inquiries made, and hundreds of people were interviewed to find out exactly what happened to cause this tragic event. White Star was blamed for the event, as well as the captain Edward J. Smith, who did go down with the ship. Others blamed the ship's architect for the flaws in the design, and still others blamed the seamen who were supposed to be keeping an eye out for such things as icebergs. Either way, there was plenty of flame to go around, and this story from all of those involved and reported on for years to come. Not only were the real stories told of this event, the fact remains that so many people are interested in this tragedy that has become one of the most famous subject lines of fictional movies and books, with movies starting in 1912 such as Saved from the Titanic all the way to James Cameron's 1997 blockbuster hit Titanic. People love to hear tales of survivors such as Jack and Rose were fictional, all the way to real-life survivors such as the unsinkable Molly Brown or Margaret Brown. Their stories of courage and them find their way to audiences all over the world, keeping this story in the minds of generations of people. One of the major results of the event that I think people need to be aware of, however, is the effect it had on the maritime law. What that means is that before the Titanic, there were no laws governing ships carrying passengers, and the rules and regulations did not exist in order to protect those passengers. The most talked about change is the fact that the Titanic had over 2,000 passengers, but when she left Southampton, it only had 16 lifeboats on board. This equated to being able to only save 1/3 of its passengers. Thus, the laws then were changed so that the ship had to have enough lifeboats to house the same number of passengers and crew on board. This law was put into place in order to avoid the same fate that many passengers faced on the night of April 14th. Other laws, such as the 24-hour radio watch, were put into place to help avoid similar tragedies. When the Titanic was in distress and calling for help, many of the other ships around had turned off their radio systems and had no one manning them, which contributed to no other ships coming to help the survivors, which ended up freezing to death in the cold waters of the Atlantic. Ships were also were required to carry distress rockets to help signal for help to nearby ships, something that the Titanic did not have enough of. Other countries also changed laws to help protect their ships and passengers. An international ice patrol was developed that would send out ships to look for icebergs in areas which ice was noted to help ships steer through them or avoid them altogether. Countries all over the world took note of the flaws and mistakes that the builders of the Titanic made and came together to use that information to help change the maritime laws for the better. These laws are still in place as of today. Lastly, I would want to turn our attention back to the one issue that existed at the time in 1912 that contributed to so many people of a lower class dying than those of the upper class, and that was the system of class. At that time, there were considered first-class passengers, second class, and third class, descending by their wealth. With the lack of boats on board, the ship and its personnel were more inclined to give the boats to the first-class women and some men than they were to any of the third or second-class passengers. As the ship sank with no boats to save them, over 1,500 passengers froze to death in the freezing cold waters of the Atlantic. This is as chilling statistic as should never be forgotten. Although the Titanic sunk over 100 years ago today, we as a society find this tragedy such a mystifying event. We've read books written on the subject, watched documentaries on it, and even got carried away with fictional accounts of characters who experienced this event firsthand. The sad truth is that was a ship that was challenged in aspects of nature as no one had ever done. Even though many experts believed the hitting of the iceberg was the event that was caused, some experts have stated that perhaps the building of the ship contained many flaws that would have never allowed to exist, meaning the watertight vaults which had their own flaws, and as they were built from the floor to the ceiling and allowed water to pour into each other, or the fact that perhaps the steel used on the ship was too thin and allowed for it to become too brittle as it was subjected to the freezing cold water of the Atlantic. Either way, this story of the RMS Titanic will always live in the hearts and minds of the world as it was the biggest, most magnificent ship of its time.